From ELCA Advocacy, this is Here I Pod. There's so much happening in our communities every week and every day that are impacted by policies at the local, state, and federal levels. Here I Pod will focus on one aspect of what's happening each episode by talking with faith-based advocates, as well as providing steps that you can take in your own advocacy efforts. In episode 6, our host Regina Banks speaks to Reverend Dr. Lamont Wells, Executive Director of the network of ELCA colleges and universities, which you will hear referred to by its acronym NECU, about the challenges facing institutions of higher education. These challenges are varied, from issues related to freedom of speech and student protest on campus, to administrative challenges like funding and the politicization of DEI initiatives. In our history segment, we'll hear from Joey Chin about Martin Luther's steadfast support for education. Finally, we'll hear from a campus pastor from Wittenberg University in Ohio. Here's Regina to get us started.
Hi, I'm Regina Banks here in Sacramento, California, and this afternoon I have with me my friend and colleague, the Reverend Dr. Lamont Wells, Executive Director of the network of ELCA colleges and universities. Good afternoon, Lamont.
Good afternoon. It's good to be here.
Good to have you. So we've been having conversations with colleagues and professionals around the ELCA about the Trump era changes in administration. And we wanted to talk to you from your perspective. What were the most significant changes the Trump administration made to federal education policy, and how are those changes being felt across the ELCA colleges and universities?
There are so many of these things that we expected and prepared for in the coming administration, but we didn't expect that they would have some of the main effects that we see now. And it's really the threats that are occurring. I believe that there'll be things that will be held up in court for many, many years, and it would take some time to actually actualize some of these things because these executive orders are not law. And I'm proud of some institutions that have realized this and are not as afraid and cowering, if you will, to some of these edicts and some of these executive orders. I remember earlier in the early February when some of the Dear Colleague letters that were threatening people and our institutions with their funding if they didn't take out DEI practices of diversity, equity, and inclusion practices. And I know the NECU institutions, the network of ELCA colleges and universities, decided to move and double down on our commitment to that. So I'm seeing various points of view. Some are afraid. Everyone is curious. Everyone is being careful because we want to make sure that we're in line. But I'm also seeing some institutions rise up and become brave. Yeah.
So it sounds like you were anticipating some of these changes. Can you share with us some of the things that you were anticipating?
So in June of 2023, I believe, is when the SCOTUS had reversed affirmative action, right? And we saw that at that point, and I had just been in this role for about 6 months at that time. And we saw that action as signaling that there'll be some unraveling of some historical things that have been helpful and necessary to advance higher education. So what the network of ELCA colleges and universities did is said, we're going to double down on our commitment to it out of a faith-based perspective, because as a part of our network, our commitment is to Lutheran core values that talks about diversity, equity, and inclusion even before it was a popular term or acronym, if you will. Often people don't realize that Martin Luther, early 500 years ago, as a part of the Reformation movement and the Protestant movement, said that education should be accessible to all. Martin Luther even said to little girls, right? Now, this is back in the 1500s.
Okay.
He opened up this understanding of the churches or faith connection to education should be assisting our higher education institutions in being connected to open accessibility. Remember, even our church, our faith belief, the organization in which I'm a part of in Lutheranism was at Wittenberg University, right? So kind of this whole movement started out of a higher education movement. As we know historically, after that, other movements have done the same and similar things. Kent State, North Carolina Central University, all of these have higher education institutions have been a catalyst, if you will, for things that have stood up against oppression and stood up against government factors like we have today.
You anticipated my next question, which was, how are the ELCA institutions responding out of Lutheran values of equity, justice, and inclusion? But you just hit that one on the head.
It's primarily because we're living into our connected mission. NECU institutions, we generally share a common calling, believing that we're all called and empowered to serve the neighbor so that all may flourish. That's one of our taglines, so that all may flourish. Like, we're in this thing so that everybody can, there's a public good to higher education. There's some intrinsic values that uplift people's understanding, helping people understand what their gifts are and how their gifts can apply to the world around us.
It's incredible. Switching gears just a little bit, we've seen an increase in public reports and political attention around anti-Semitism, particularly on college campuses. What trends or patterns are you noticing across the network of ELCA colleges and universities?
So historically, these institutions in their founding were designed to encourage education and vocational acumen, if you will, for migrant immigrant populations that were coming from Europe to America as the churches were founded, and then education institutions were founded. So some of the core values of vocational identity, some of the core values of service to neighbor, some of the core values of open and accessibility to all, affirming the whole person, having an inclusive and welcoming community has been a part of our core values, and critical thinking and academic freedom have been a part of the DNA of the 28 schools that are part of the network that were founded by Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, predecessor bodies like the Lutheran Church in America and the American Lutheran Church and the Association of Evangelical Lutheran Churches. So I bring that up and frame it in this way, Regina, because we've taken that as a part of our DNA. And recently, with the rise of anti-Semitism and other and Islamophobia and other things that are occurring on college campuses, I have found that our institutions were framed and ready in such a way to be inclusive. And so when many of the protests and many of the things that were occurring on campuses in the last year, there was greater dialogue. And there were formats for formation and forums for people to have greater understanding that were occurring on our campuses. It wasn't so much of the vitriol and things like that. For instance, Muhlenberg College, which is in Allentown, Pennsylvania, was obviously founded as a Lutheran college, but now has a predominant Jewish population on that campus. Okay. Much like Augsburg University, which is one of our flagship schools there in Minneapolis, St. Paul, Minnesota, has a high population because of the demographics around them of Somalians and other immigrants that have come in with Islamic understanding and faith-based community. So our institutions have what we like to call rooted ourselves in Lutheranism, but definitely open. We call ourselves rooted and open institutions that allows for a higher level of religious pluralism. And that's something that is a high value for us. So Regina, for me and the institutions that we have or engaged with have not had some of the misunderstandings in those ways, but they have learned how to operate in an understanding of not just tolerance, but being curious and being understanding about other faith traditions that are not like someone's own.
What does it mean to show solidarity with those non-traditionally Lutheran communities, those Jewish communities on campus in Pennsylvania, those Islamic communities that are in the Twin Cities area? What does that mean? What does it look like embodied?
I think it's a part of fostering a higher level of accountability to some of the missional ideals that we have. If we're talking about being an inclusive and welcoming community, that means that all means all. It can't be higher levels of exclusion. So kind of practicing and using as a litmus test solidarity issues and finding ways of commonality rather than living into the divisive nature of the differences. And we know that in human relations, we can find more things that we agree with and or connect to, right? Like, perfect whole well-being, access to good food and good water and all of those kinds of things that are humanly connecting us, right? Rather than focusing on those things. And that's to my point about the value, seeing the value in solidarity, those things that seek to divide us. We can spend more time thinking and focusing on those things that help us to align with each other, help us to live in community with each other, helping us to understand where people are coming from, right? So there could be, after the Hamas attacks there in Israel, we can have a sympathy for the Jewish population as well as those who are living in Gaza, understanding the pain that they're dealing with as an injustice as well. So one of the things that I love about being a Lutheran is that we have a level of connection in our pluralism that we often talk about things, and this is primarily related to the word and sacrament, is we talk about it being both and, right? We talk about the concept of both and. So I think that's a value of solidarity, right? That we don't have to always agree on everything, but I think being able to, as a people of God, as a people of the human race, seeing ways for us to connect is very, very important, rather than living into ways for us to be divided.
It's amazing. Lamont, free speech has become a flashpoint issue, especially around protests, controversial speakers, and campus climate. Have there been any protests on any of the NICU campuses in the last 50 days? If so, what were those about? What were the circumstances? Can you share a little bit about the campus culture right now?
Again, I think that many of our institutions have been stunted. People are concerned about finances, whether they're even going to be there, right? So because many of the executive orders have been a threat to financial things, so people have been we're living in kind of a shock and a numbness, if you will, over the last 50 days, scrambling to make things better, make things whole, or make things tolerable. So when it comes to speaking up and speaking out, we always encourage deep questioning and having dialogue and exploring ways of speaking truth to power and speaking meaning to our communities. But I've not seen a rise in direct protests. There were some that were involved in some of the protests the other day, the hands-off protests that have been engaging in various areas. But many of our institutions don't find themselves in metropolitan areas. They trend to be in rural areas. So sometimes disconnected, if you will, from some of the larger aspects of the protests that you might see in media or the television.
So given that several of the colleges and universities don't find themselves in those major metropolitan areas, but college and higher education is meant to be a time of questioning and a bit of that small p protest time, learning about yourself, learning about the world. What does it mean to cultivate a brave space or a safe space on NICU campuses right now?
And that can mean different things at different times, right? Because one of the things that I am seeing is a higher level of empathy and concern for our international students. So what I am seeing is on campuses, people are infuriated at what is happening with the deportations and things like that. And there have been some deportations of students who are part of NECU schools. One of the young men that led the network of ELCA colleges student summit last year, in fact, it was his idea. He got a letter and his student visa was revoked about 30 days before his graduation, right?
Oh my God.
And he was sent back to Bangladesh. And so those are the kinds of things. And what has happened is students have wanted to rally and rise up, but sometimes that is not always safe for the individuals or the victims or the marginalized or the oppressed, right? So people are learning that sometimes we have to be wise in how we protest, because some of the protests may draw attention to the institution in ways that may not be helpful, and to that brave space, that safe space for our students. So there's some wisdom that is growing as a part of the protest movement that I love to see, because sometimes it's not always having a bullhorn, if you will, and yelling out a building, but sometimes it is a level of understanding that this is wrong, but the protest might be being more empathetic and being more of, as I call, a ministry of presence for the victim instead of focusing on the oppressor. Right. So what I'm seeing is our campuses are pulling into a lot of care. People sometimes are raising money to help send some of the students back on planes and safe, so that they're not in camps or in prison or things like that. So I love what I'm seeing here in these communities, rallying and supporting our students in those areas and capacity.
Lamont, I hear that, and I hear that it's not always the safest or the wisest to be out with a bullhorn. Are the administrations of the colleges and university, are you having private advocacy conversations? If so, can you share generally the nature of what those conversations are about, who you're talking to, what is the ask on the back end?
Particularly as I shared earlier about our immediate reaction and response to what we saw probably coming, we have organized in the past few months a document entitled "So That All May Belong," where we were clear. Schools got together with our theological faculty working group and our diversity, equity, and inclusion officers, and wrote clearly our articulation as a faith-affiliated institution network affiliated with the ELCA, doubling down on our commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so we have been working on that over the last few months, and just published it here this month in April. And so we have been meeting and holding forums and helping our lawyers, our legal team strategize how we are going to show diversity, equity, and inclusion, and all of these things related to that are a part of us living out our faith through our religious freedom that we still want to hold on to. So yes, we do meet. Our diversity and inclusion officers meet in cohorts monthly. Our presidents gather. In fact, it will be the primary topic of what we call our Summer Presidents Institute, where our presidents gather and spend some time and respite strategizing on how to respond to many of these issues that are going on around us in higher education and as it relates to this current age.
What do you see as the likely long-term implications of what you're seeing on campuses right now? Is it going to affect student enrollment? Is it going to affect the bottom line, the finances of the NECU institutions?
Regina, yeah, there are many things that are occurring, and many of the institutions are struggling in various ways to respond to the things, but they're dealing with multiple things at one time, right? So, for instance, over the last year, they have been dealing with the strain of the financial aid. The FAFSA form was delayed, and many of them weren't able to make their financial aid awards, right? Not only are they dealing with the Dear Colleague letter and the threat of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives and programs that are related to funding and those things that may not be funded at the federal level, many of the schools are also dealing with the reality of the demographic cliff, right, that is at hand, where there is not the birth population rate that is up enough to be able to fill the seats, if you will, of our institution. I find that many institutions have been struggling in these particular areas, along with many of them having to deal not just from the federal concerns, but the state level concerns. I'm most concerned about our Iowan schools, because if that state tuition grant is not given to the students there in Iowa at our private institutions, because the state legislator decides to take it away if the private institutions don't get rid of their diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, then that would limit the opportunity for many of our private schools like Luther in Decorah, Iowa, or Waldorf University in Forest Hills, or Wartburg College in Waverly, Iowa, or Grandview University in Des Moines, the capital, where they're fighting many of these things at the state level so that the institution won't suffer. But I'm telling you right now, my concern is if the access to those funds does not get released or it keeps remaining to be threatened, then I believe that some of our institutions will suffer some great loss. And that's why I also believe that as a church, the ELCA should lift up a higher level of advocacy in our spaces, in our local jurisdictions and municipalities in support of education. The ELCA has a social statement that talks about our true involvement, our intentional, assertive involvement in supporting public good of education, supporting higher education in ways that we see our schools need help now. There are many schools that I could name. I'm praying for all of them that are struggling in various areas of enrollment numbers. They're struggling with donors who are, many of them are threatening to withhold money if they don't support some of the rollback on diversity, equity, and inclusion in other areas. And these institutions are trying to live into their mission, but we also know that mission needs resources. So my prayer is that there is a nation, a world, a people of faith that would rise up to support higher education institutions. You know, I'm a graduate of Morehouse College, and I make sure that I know that HBCUs suffer, so I make sure that I invest in resources in those areas. And as a person of faith in the Lutheran tradition, I would love to see a greater rise or a greater connection of our congregants and people and our parishioners and people who participate in ministry with us to support higher education institutions that are part of the network of ELCA colleges and universities. They have provided greater good than they have some of the divisive things that many individuals have often said is a reason for us not to support higher education.
Lamont, you've shared a lot of maybe new information for our listeners. Is there anything that you would ask for them to do in their local context that would be a benefit to the network of colleges and universities and for the education of the students that are going there now?
I think that what I have found as an opportunity, I call it low-hanging fruit, is many of our colleges are in rural areas or conservative areas and communities and under some kind of duress sometimes from individuals and powers that be. And I think that if we can find kind of even some letter writing campaigns and contacting their senators, when I think of Augustana University there in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, writing, who is now the speaker, the chairman, if you will, of the majority leader in the Senate, Senator Thune. So writing to him and saying, look at the value and the beauty of what Augustana University is providing our citizens and the area there in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. So getting the parishioners there to write letters and to make phone calls so that you want to tell them to support the funding of the Pell Grant and the supplemental education grants that are around. Because of the culture that we're in now and the kind of climate that we're in, I think that our institutions of faith, our church individuals, our parishioners ought to put some action, if you will, by continuing to pray, continuing to be present, but also contacting their local legislators and their state legislators and then their federal legislators in supporting the higher education communities, because we know, and even they know, many of them have gone to college. When we see this higher level of anti-intellectualism and anti-education institutions or anti-higher education institutions, that kind of energy and that climate, but these individuals went to many of these schools that helped them to get where they are. So I would see us as people of faith helping our individuals who are to serve us as political leaders, holding up a mirror to them and say, listen, how did you get here? Didn't you go to Harvard? Didn't you go to Yale? Didn't you go to University of Iowa? Are your children, you're sending your children to institutions that that they're supporting and funding, but yet are trying to squash the opportunity and squash the chance for access to education for underrepresented communities, marginalized communities who are greatly affected, if you will, by this anti-intellectual and anti-higher education movement. And many individuals need to rise up and find ways to support. I also think that financial support to institutions, I never realized how important giving back to your institution is key. Passing it forward, like letting it, reaching back and offering financial support at whatever level, whether it's $100 to the annual fund, whether it's $1,000 to the annual fund or 10,000, it doesn't matter. Finding ways that we can show a higher level of support to our higher education community would be very important. I wish I could get a bullhorn at church line assembly or some of our Senate assemblies and rally our people to support and rally behind our higher education institutions, particularly now at a time when they're most vulnerable, at a time when they're dealing with divisive tactics that will be having them caught up. Because as I see it right now, the only people benefiting from some of this divisive tactics are lawyers who are being paid a lot of money to keep us in court and to adjudicate some of these concerns and some of these issues.
I do love to ask this question at the end. Where have you seen the gospel recently?
I travel to the 28 colleges and universities as I serve on 19 of the boards, and I attend board meetings, and I speak at baccalaureates, I'm at graduation services. I see a lot of positive energy, people whose lives are being changed, and particularly with our understanding of vocation as a calling for all, I'm seeing the gospel of and the ministry related to the Lutheran tradition, helping students see their own gifts and their own passions and even their own pain as a part of how they are all being called to serve the world, right? Many of our colleges are uniquely positioned, if you will, to cultivate this kind of vocational imagination. And that's where I see the gospel flourishing, connecting faith with justice, connecting faith with service, connecting faith with their service. And that calling is not reserved just for the religious, but it's a universal invitation. And that's how I see the gospel flourishing. The other area I think is as I see people understanding faith differently as not just a destination, but helping individuals see faith as a journey. Because I remember when I went to college, my faith was tested as I left my homogenous church community and then went into a pluralistic, interfaith, ecumenical community where people believe things differently than me, right? So I took a little bit of this and I took a little bit of that. And that's what I'm seeing on college campuses, people being curious and students realizing that spirituality is more important sometimes than just being religious, if you will. Many are seeking, many are questioning, and many are also healing from some of their past religious practices and experiences. And that's how I see the gospel, particularly the gospel of Jesus Christ, at work and the flourishing, if you will, of a whole person seeing themselves made in the image of God, the imago Dei. That's the DEI I like. The imago Dei, the imago Dei, where people are seeing themselves, if you will, in the image of God. And that's the power. That's the beauty of what I see as a part of the network of ELCA colleges and universities and in many other areas in higher education everywhere. And I think that's beautiful.
So this has been a thrilling and informative conversation that we've had here today. Thank you so much for your time. I've been here with the Reverend Dr. Lamont Wells, Executive Director of the Network of ELCA Colleges and Universities. Thank you again, Lamont.
Thank you so much. It's been my pleasure. And I hope that we can continue to help the people to understand that this is an important subject matter for us to address and support and to advocate for.
When schools flourish, things go well, and the church is secure. God has preserved the church through schools. They are its conservatories. These were the words of Martin Luther, professor, teacher, and an unwavering supporter of education. Throughout his life, Martin Luther was a strong advocate for education for all, as he understood it to be the foundation for building up wise and faithful leaders. Many aspects of our modern-day public education system can be traced to Luther's teachings and writings. In 1524, Luther wrote a letter to civil leaders calling on them to establish and maintain a system of schools for what was then a largely illiterate population. He wanted people to be able to read and write so that they could interpret and understand the Bible on their own, and he consistently promoted education for both boys and girls, saying only one thing is lacking: the earnest desire to train the young and to benefit and serve the world with able men and women. Luther even supported physical education, drama, and music programs, once saying, God can be honored not only by work, but also by rest and recreation. As a university professor, Luther pushed his students to ask questions and think critically, challenging the status quo and norms of his time. For him, education was meant to serve the common good and uplift the inherent worth and dignity of all people, including children. Once, when speaking to a fellow professor who rejoiced at the sight of fruit by hanging on a cherry branch, Luther said, "Why don't you think of your own children? They are in front of you all the time, and you will learn more from them than a cherry bough." Today, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America lives out Luther's legacy by operating numerous elementary schools, high schools, child care centers, colleges, and universities. Many ELCA leaders continue to work towards expanding lifelong opportunities for everyone to learn, recognizing education as an essential part of living out the gospel and answering God's call to create disciples who will embrace their baptismal vocation to serve the church and love their neighbors.
Hi, I'm Pastor Tracy Paschke-Johannes. My pronouns are she, her, and I am currently serving at Wittenberg University as the campus pastor. This is my third academic year at Wittenberg. So last fall, our students were directly impacted and our students' education was halted for 8 days following the hateful comments that were made on the national scene regarding Haitian immigrants in our community of Springfield, Ohio. And at first, our students had heard rumors on the internet about the Haitian community, and we were hearing things within our local community. And then unfortunately, it rose to national prominence. Within a week, our campus was shut down as a result of threats that were directed at our campus community, at the greater Springfield community. Local schools, as well as government businesses, were also impacted for a total of 8 days in which 95% of our students returned to their homes as a result of classes being moved to online. Our students were incredibly angry and became much more aware of who their neighbors were. As you may be aware, a lot of times in college campuses and communities, it can become a little bit of a bubble. Our students interact with one another. They are very passionate about their majors, their extracurricular activities, their international travel. But the knowledge about the greater community is something that comes after they've been there for a little while. So while our students knew that their neighbors were Haitian, some of them didn't have a great connection to the Haitian community. However, after October and this issue that occurred that impacted them directly, they became incredibly angry. First, that their lives were being impacted by this. And these are students of COVID. They had spent much of their high school time online and did not wish to lose more time that they already felt like they had missed out on as a result of COVID in high school. They were angry that people had spoke about their neighbors in this way, that the national scene had given our community this image that it was some dangerous place, when in reality, our students, some of our upper class students, had worked with the Haitian community in healthcare and in the schools as well. So it deeply impacted them. Some of the results that came after that week of being away, learning online again, resulted in some professors reaching out and deepening the relationship with the Haitian community. Some of our students were learning more about the history of Haiti, how our immigrant neighbors had moved to this area, and the impact that they were having on our community, that there was manufacturing that was opening up again as a result of their presence in immigration. A few of our students also had immigrant stories of their own and felt empowered and emboldened to speak a little bit more directly about that. Again, that was a pretty small number of students, but there was a sense that we were a greater community in Springfield, and that what impacted one person definitely impacted the greater community. And when I spoke to my students about issues of faith and justice related to what occurred in the fall, we have a really broad variety of students with different belief systems. College is really a place where students can explore their faith and beliefs and values. So I kind of found that continued. Some of them were asking deeper, broader questions about their faith. A group of us were invited to go to the local Catholic Mass and attend a worship service with our Haitian neighbors and enjoy a meal together with a few other Catholic parishes in the area. And then that spurred some conversation with our particular chapel group about our neighbors and how God calls us to welcome. So that was a very impactful experience, both for the greater Springfield community as well as our students. And again, it isn't like a light switch, right? Like, we are not in a position and we are not in a time where all of a sudden, because this one incident occurred, students now suddenly are deeply involved in some way. But what it did was, much like other topics and other things that impact students' lives, it kind of gets into the soil and it kind of starts churning in them and asking questions and starting to impact what grows there, right? So I wouldn't say we, all of a sudden started growing a brand new thing or that there was some huge dynamic change. But I think as the soil was tilled and their faith story unfolds, this is a piece of that. So I was thankful to be able to be a part of that with our students and to be able to share with them ways in which our Lutheran faith and heritage calls us to love our neighbor, how Jesus was an immigrant himself, a refugee, how the scripture speaks of ways in which we are called to love our neighbor. So that was an incredibly impactful experience for myself as a leader and for our students.
As we close out this episode, I want to remind our listeners that you can always take action by messaging your representatives using the ELCA Action Center. We currently have an action alert to support schools, universities, and students. You can use this alert to advocate for robust educational support for all communities. You can find a link to that alert, as well as how to sign up to receive all of our alerts by email, in the show notes. Thank you to our guests, Lamont Wells and Tracy Paschke-Johannes, for joining us on this episode. This concludes this episode of Here I Pod. If you want to contact us, you can email us over at elcaadvocacypodcast@elca.org or leave us a voicemail at 866-740-3522. Thank you for listening.